Hey guys, what's up? So, I decided since I'm going to be working pretty long hours and almost full time, I'd give you a little something to just keep you held off for a while. Instead of just doing a review, I'm going to do a double review. And I figured I could do both of these movies because I actually have found copies of them now. I don't have DVDs of them. I do have VHS copies of them as like decoration back there, but I don't have a VCR. Luckily, I found them online, and these films are both very hard to find. Well, one of them is very hard to find and at a cheap price, and the other you can buy a Korean DVD of it, much like with the previous release of Eraserhead and the current release of Also Show from the SS. But from what I've heard, the Korean DVD, it really isn't that good. So I decided to grab a rip of the Blu-ray of it offline. But tonight's movies are Blood for Dracula and Flesh for Frankenstein. Both of these are supposedly they're also known as Andy Warhol's Frankenstein and Andy Warhol's Dracula. Now, Andy Warhol, he was the guy that did the fucking pop art paint, the pop art of the Campbell's soup cans, and I mean that's what he's probably most well known for. But he was a really good artist, and he directed that film Empire. That's an 8-hour long shot of the Empire State Building that's non-stop, and it's very, very boring, and I watched it. So now I'm gonna see what he has to do with this. Other than the fact that he's the producer on both of these films, neither of them he had no input to the films, so that's probably a very good thing. I've heard some pretty good things about both of them. I know Flesh for Frankenstein is available on a Criterion Collection DVD release. So Criterion Collection, who they put out like Videodrome and Naked Lunch and a lot of other like classic films. They usually release very important, culturally significant films, and they've done quite a few horror movie releases, and apparently they did a DVD release of this in like the 90s, and there hasn't been an American DVD release since. Now there is a UK there's a UK Blu-ray of both of these films available. The thing is, I don't have a multi-region Blu-ray, so I can't watch them in America. So that obviously sucks. But the premise for both of these movies is different. So this is just a little introduction telling you what films I'm going to review, and I will put the time marks for when each review starts under each, like right here, and I'll label them. So if you want to only see my review of one of them, or you want to just get straight to the review, you can click it. But let's get on with the first film. Yeah. So starting off, we have a science fiction horror film, a science fiction art house horror film from 1973, and tonight's movie is a adaptation of the ever so classic Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but with a very unique twist. And tonight's movie is Flesh for Frankenstein. As I said, I have the VHS of it. And it says right here, the goriest, sexiest Frankenstein ever. This VHS tape's nearly 25 years old. So this movie is about the Baron Frankenstein, who lives with his Baroness, who happens to be his sister, and he had children with them, and he dreams of creating a super race of artificial humans, and he builds a female monster, and then out of body parts, and then he needs like a male monster in order for him to have sex with her, for them to create a master race of Frankensteins. it doesn't make much sense. It sounds very weird, and it just sounds like something right up my alley. So yeah, without further ado, let's check out Flesh for Frankenstein. So the movie opens up with some very nice, like, eerie kind of music playing over the credits as a spider kind of slowly comes down onto the lens of the camera. We then realize that it's the bedroom of both of the children in the film, and they have, like, medical equipment in their room, and their room looks like some kind of, like, cross between a mad scientist's laboratory and a dungeon. And then they perform a surgery on a stuffed animal they have there, and then they decide that they've lost the patient, so they behead it. And yeah. So then it's later, and they're in a carriage with their mother, and they're just going through the forest, and the Baron is yelling at his assistant, Otto, who, and it's really funny to hear the Baron talk in this film, because the actor who portrays him, Udo Kier, I believe his name is, he, like, I forget, all I know, like, really, the only things I know about him are that he's a very big, kind of, like, actor when it comes to, like, you know, B movies and like campy movies. Like, he's really well known for his campy acting, and his acting here is very, very campy. Also, the accent he puts on to pull off like a Serbian kind of accent, it's almost Tommy Wiseau from The Room, like, levels of bad accent. And that is beautiful, because it makes every scene with him very memorable. Not very quotable. Most, you know, there are quite a few scenes that have quotes, that have lines in them that are very quotable. But it's still really entertaining. So like I said, the acting in this movie is pretty decent all around. Everybody turns in at least a halfway decent performance. But Udo Kier, his performance is probably the most entertaining out of all of them. He makes the character of Baron Frankenstein a lot more entertaining and likable, and than really any of the other characters in the movie. There's, like, Otto, his assistant. There's the Baron's children. There's the Baroness, who is also Baron Frankenstein's sister. You know, there are quite a few characters here. They're not the most complex, but in a film like this, I don't think they need to be. The makeup effects in this movie are probably the best, not the best part of it, but definitely one of the highlights of the film. The makeup effects are pretty damn good, but the gore effects are really, really cheesy. Like, really, really cheesy. Like, I want to say almost like Pieces level of cheesy, or it reminded me of Dawn of the Dead, even though the gore in that movie isn't like cheesy. Like, the gore in that film is great. It's just that the blood is, like, bright red, because it's supposed to look like a comic book, and that's kind of what goes on here. The blood is, like, bright red, and it looks like red paint. But I don't have a complaint. I don't want to complain about that, because I think it gives the film a bit more of a kind of like Hammer horror style. I say that having not seen many Hammer horror films, only like a few clips. But while on the topic of Hammer horror films, this film has a lot in common with them. Like, it has very nice, kind of elaborate castle sets, and it has a very Hammer kind of look and feel to it. It feels like one of the Hammer horror films from the 70s. But since the movie, you know, has a very serious tone, and it has this kind of, like, you know, kind of Hammer feel to it. It makes the campy scenes and the campy moments in the film and everything, like the campy elements of the film, just makes it all the more. It makes the movie all the more ridiculous and entertaining. The lighting and sound mix are good. The camera work is nice. The film's well shot. The music is nice. It's kind of eerie at times. The film does have a nice atmosphere, but it does get ruined by the fact that the film is omega beyond, just extremely cheesy and campy. The film isn't boring. I would definitely say there are pacing issues with it, but it's not a boring movie. It's got something going on to keep you interested or entertained throughout the entire thing, and I'm not gonna lie, I was focused on this film the entire time because they keep throwing like these kind of weird, quirky curveballs at you with different characters and different like subplots and all this other stuff, and it really comes together nicely in a nice, like, cheesy, fun package. On the gore meter from 1 to 10, 1 being something like Nosferatu, and 10 being something like Brain Dead. Flesh for Frankenstein is probably about a 5.5. There's a lot of over-the-top gore here, and when I say over-the-top, I mean it's, like, so bad and over-the-top that you can't help but giggle at it a lot when you see it. Now, while this film is another adaptation of the classic horror story, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it still has enough going on and enough things to make it different from the original story, to the point that it's not really an adaptation of it as much as it is like a partially inspired by, and then it's its own thing of really weird and I don't want to say surreal, but like weird and perverse kind of. It's Frankenstein. It's like a combination of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, how it's like, perverse, and like how it's really perverse and stuff, and then it's a combination of that and the classic Frankenstein, how the classic Frankenstein was very dark and eerie, and it really shows it off so well. I think it gets the kind of style of it being like, hey, we're being serious, like, hey, look, this is like trying to be serious, but it's also a very quirky, perverse, kind of gross, like, accidental comedy, and I absolutely adore this film because of it. I will say that it's not the best, version or like different adaptation of Frankenstein that I've ever seen. It's definitely not that, but as far as originality goes, when it comes to, adapting like a classic story and putting a twist on it, this is definitely one of the better ones that I've seen. I'd probably have to give this one a 4 out of 5. I really, really enjoyed it. And now I'm gonna go watch Blood for Dracula, because I still have to watch that for this double review, and because I hope it's as entertaining. It does star Udo Kier, who was the Baron Frankenstein, and he also plays Dracula in Blood for Dracula. So, let's go do that. And tonight's other movie is a exploitation vampire horror I guess kind of horror comedy from 1974, and tonight's other movie is Blood for Dracula, also known as Andy Warhol's Dracula, Andy Warhol Presents Dracula, and many, many other titles. Actually, I'm pretty sure those are the only titles. So, this is another film that is a kind of art house adaptation that is produced by Andy Warhol, and all I really know about it is that it's a version of Dracula, the classic tale Dracula, which, in my honest opinion, the best adaptation of Dracula is Nosferatu from 22, which I think is the best. But the movie is about the Count himself traveling to Italy with his servant in order to find a bride. There's also some kind of like subplot in there about him only being able to drink the blood of virgins, and And in this movie, Roman Polanski, the director of Rosemary's Baby, makes an appearance apparently. So let's watch. So, Blood for Dracula opens up much like Flesh for Frankenstein did, with credits, and credits in the same font, I might add, with something, next to it, or coming, down, or, something else in the frame as the credits kind of rolled by. And same as Flesh for Frankenstein, it has good music, but this music is far better than the music in Flesh for Frankenstein. This time, it's Udo Kier in the frame as Dracula, and he's putting on makeup while looking in the mirror, which is funny because it's you later see that he was looking in the mirror the entire time, but he has no reflection. So, Dracula meets with his, servant associate, who, tells him, look, you need to drink the blood of a virgin in order to live longer. I mean, you know this. So, we need to go to Italy, where most of the... Okay, then. Where most of the, young women that are of marrying age are virgins because of the church. So that's what he does. He goes there. He travels there, and I would like to say that even though Udo Kier's performance as Dracula in this film is still very entertaining, and he still has the kind of cheesy accent that's on par with Tommy Wiseau's accent in The Room. It's not as funny because he's not constantly yelling and saying really ridiculous things. The dialogue he has in this film, while it is very quotable, it's not as ridiculous and fun. So yeah. So apparently this version of Dracula is one of the kinds of he's supposed to be a vampire, and he can go out in sunlight. But I think the thing I think is cool about this is, they made it to where vampires can actually be killed, other than with, a stake through the heart, or sunlight, or garlic. And yes, garlic is actually a factor. It's actually mentioned in the film. But instead of going out in the sunlight and dying, he can go out in the sunlight. I'm sure if he stays out for too long, it'll hurt him. But he can go out in the sunlight. And I think the thing they made to make it he can go out in the sunlight, but if he doesn't drink the blood of a virgin every so often, he will die, and he will get very sick and die. So I honestly think that's a pretty cool little twist to the movie. So the acting in the movie, same as the previous film, is okay. Everybody turns in a decent performance. Same with the writing. The writing is still decent. The makeup effects, as I said before, are good. The gore effects are cheesy. The characters are not too complex. They don't constantly change or anything. Although Dracula is easily one of the most likable characters, and his assistant is also probably a close second for the most likable character, because his assistant... it seems like they kind of switched roles in this film, because this time the assistant, servant, is more ridiculous and over the top and saying funny things, and the movie, and I'll be honest, the movie actually focuses a bit more on the servant trying to get the virgins to Dracula than it does on Dracula going out for the virgins, so that's kind of a negative I have to mention. But this film still really it's still really entertaining movie. The film, just like in Flesh for Frankenstein, has a very, Hammer horror look and feel to it. Again, I've never seen a Hammer horror film, at least as far as I know. I'm pretty sure I own at least one of them, but, I haven't watched any of them. I'm sure I'll get around to them eventually. I know there's a couple that I'm interested in. I'm definitely interested in checking out some of the ones with, Christopher Lee as Dracula, but for now, I do know the look and style of a Hammer horror film. I've seen clips from them and stuff like that. So the camera work here is also really, really nice, and it's a bit better than the camera work in the previous one. Um, the sound mix is also very well done. I'm not gonna lie. The sound mix is probably is better than it is in Flesh for Frankenstein. The lighting is also really good. The music is also absolutely fantastic in this film, and it's definitely better than the music in Flesh for Frankenstein. I'm making a lot of comparisons here because they're basically like brothers, and they're basically brothers. They're made by the same people. They're both reimaginings of classic horror stories, and I would have loved to see this go on. And I'll be honest, I would have loved to see this series go on to the point that we had like I don't know, fucking, I gotta come up with a really good one. Bandages for the Mummy, like something ridiculous like that. Like if it would have kept going and going, I probably would have kept watching the series, and I probably would love it. But sadly, there's only 2 films in this somewhat series, even though they're not really connected. So the pacing in this was actually pretty decent for the most part. And because this film does have campy effects, and it is very campy in the way that it portrays its characters, for some reason that doesn't ruin the kind of atmosphere and pacing of the film. It probably has to do with the fact that even though this film is, this film isn't as equally perverse in nature and plot-wise, but I would still say it probably has the same amount of nudity and sex in it. But still, I feel like Flesh for Frankenstein, like, the main plot point was him building a monster to fuck another monster to create, like, zombie Frankenstein babies. Frankenstein's monster babies, so that's, yeah, it's not as perverse and over the top as Flesh for Frankenstein, which is why I think the atmosphere in the film holds up pretty well. Also, as I said before, really good lines in this, really good dialogue delivered, really quotable dialogue from Udo Kier and the guy who was the servant. I can't remember his real name for the life of me. I don't fucking know anymore. On the gore meter from 1 to 10, 1 being something like Nosferatu, which is a version of Dracula, and 10 being something like Brain Dead, Blood for Dracula is probably a 3. It is startlingly low on the gore, and honestly that's not a bad thing for me. There's just something about the film. The film has a style. Like, you see that they're in like this is at least supposed to be in like the early 1800s. Everybody's living in castles, there's peasants, and like the things are happening. I'm pretty sure they mention like Karl Marx in the film. They mentioned the Communist Manifesto being written, and I forget when that was published, but I'm sure it wasn't in the 40s. But at this time, in this big-ass house and castle, they have like working toilets and bathtubs, like modern toilets and bathtubs, and they talk about reading magazines. So it's kind of a mashup of timelines, which honestly gives the film a really cool kind of style. Just like in Flesh for Frankenstein, I didn't point this out, but there's a scene, like during the entire film, it really holds up, like the whole, oh, this is like the 1800s or 1600s in like fucking Serbia, and it definitely holds up pretty well. Then you see inside the Baron's laboratory a clock on the wall, like a battery-operated clock. It doesn't have cords or anything coming out. It's a battery-operated clock, and I don't think those were out back in the time when they needed torches to light rooms. So, yeah. Okay, but yeah, no, for the gore, it's a 3. There's like 1 decapitation in the entire film. And there's 1 scene of impaling and like some neck biting, which really isn't that bad at all. There's one thing I'd like to say before I get to my final wrap-up. I'd like to say that this is the only movie where you will see Count Dracula attempt to suck the blood out of a loaf of bread. That happens in this movie. Okay, So although I prefer Flesh for Frankenstein because it's a far more cheesy, entertaining movie, this movie is still absolutely awesome. Like, it is better than Flesh for Frankenstein from almost every standpoint. The thing is, when I went into Blood for Dracula, I expected the same thing as Flesh for Frankenstein. I expected something, you know, kind of goofy and cheesy and over the top. And, I mean, it is a little bit over the top at times, but other than a few moments here and there, it's really not as, like, entertainingly campy. But it still tells a pretty cool, interesting story, so I'd probably have to give it a 4.5 out of 5, 9 out of 10. Like, this one is really, really fucking solid, and I would highly recommend it. If you're only gonna watch one of these, you know, if you have a choice between watching Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula, and you want something that's a bit more, that's not, you know, as stupid and cheesy, I would definitely go for something like Blood for Dracula instead of Flesh for Frankenstein. Now I'm gonna go watch the new Blu-ray of Mallrats that I bought today. I'll see you guys next time. So anyway, guys, if you liked the video, like my channel, be sure to like this video, favorite it, whatever you want, and maybe subscribe perhaps. I would really, really appreciate that. And check the links in the description below. There are links to things like my Tumblr, Twitter, all that, Facebook. All that is in the description below. Hey there, kids. Do you want to get cool stuff in the mail like this? Or this? Or even this? Well, then subscribe to Horror Block today. Have you ever wanted to do cool cosplays like this? Or even this? Well, now you can. Subscribe to Moonchild Cosplay on YouTube, and you can see all her tutorials on how to do cool stuff like this. Do you want to get cool horror and exploitation film t-shirts like this? Or this? Or this? Well, then go to RottenCotton.com to check out all of their premium t-shirts.